And I'm going to stop my video and I'm going to share my screen. There we go. And I'm gonna this out of my way and start the slideshow. Okay, before we get started, I did want to mention another London update, as I've been doing the last couple of weeks, as it happens. Last week, we talked about gas lamps, street lamps that were lit by gas, and I told you there were still some of those in London today. Well, just the other day, a group won not an injunction, but basically they got 4 gas-lit lamps in Covent Garden listed as grade 2 listings, which mean you cannot alter them, you cannot change them, they're protected, historically protected. And they did this, these 4 lamps were put up in 1910, but they did this because the Westminster Council wants to convert 275 of these existing gas-lit lamps that are in Westminster. They want to convert them to LED lighting because they said it's safer. It's not safe to have the gas-lit ones anymore. But there's been a real pushback from a few preservation groups, including this group that managed to get these 4 grade 2 listed. So now the Westminster Council says they're only going to do 94, and we'll see how far they get with those. But I just thought that was an interesting tidbit since we were just talking about those last week. This week, we're on the next to the last week, and we are discussing Victorian London. So mute your microphones if you haven't already done so, please. So again, a pretty similar structure to the previous weeks. We're going to look at daily life. We're going to look at some key events. A lot of emphasis this week on social reform. There was a lot going on in this period with social reform, with civil engineering, and hopefully there'll be time to squeeze in the architecture. This is a pretty crowded lecture this time, so we might have to spill that over to next time. Let's see where we get. But anyway, at this time, we were at a period where London was really one of the most important cities in the world at this point. A large proportion of the nation's wealth was pouring into these civil engineering projects. This was a time when we were seeing buildings like the Palace of Westminster getting rebuilt after a fire. Palace of Westminster, more commonly known to people as the Houses of Parliament. This is when Trafalgar Square was developed. It was when Tower Bridge was built. And the Thames was transformed as a result of a massive engineering project to create a sewer system in London that's still being used to this day. It was also a time period when we saw continued advancements in transit infrastructure, as we talked about last time. We talked about paved roads and we talked about the railway coming in. Well, now we are seeing new and renovated bridges. We're seeing more roads put in. And we're seeing the London Underground, that's the equivalent of the subway system here, being put in as well. And then finally, as I said, with social reform, this was a time of really great social change. We already talked about the Industrial Revolution and the changes that started making. We see continued advancements in technology, mechanization, medicine, big changes in medicine. But we also see on the flip side of that a widening gap between economic classes, and that led to social reform and legislation, and we'll look at some of that as well. So the Victorians, again, not really going to go into detail here. Very quickly, the last Hanoverian king, or Georgian king, if you will, was William IV, the only one not called George. He was the younger brother of George III, and he was, the younger son of George III, and he was the brother of George IV. Well, William died without any legitimate heirs in 1837, and he was succeeded by his niece Victoria. And of course, she gave her name to the well-known period in history, the Victorian period in history. As many of you probably know, she married her cousin, her first cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. And Victoria and Albert had 9 children, most of whom married into and populated the royal houses of Europe. And that gave Victoria the nickname, the grandmother of Europe. So you see here on the left, this is Victoria in her coronation robes, and then much later, a photograph of her here on the right. So last time we talked about London's population swelling in size from around 630,000 to over 3 million between 1714 and 1860. And by the time we get to 1910, so shortly after the end of the Victorian reign, just a few years, there were over 7 million people living in London. So London was, especially if you look at this time period between 1860 and 1910, huge explosion of population. And all of that plays into some of these key topics we're going to talk about in terms of daily life: poverty, work, housing, childhood and education, and health. Poverty is very important here, and it kind of weaves its way through the entire, these other daily life issues. So because of the economic expansion of the Industrial Revolution, it was great, but you again had a lot of people pouring into London looking for work, moving from the countryside and farming communities, trying to get jobs in factories. And despite this kind of economic expansion and maybe what you see as a boom, living conditions among London's poor were really appalling. There were large numbers of skilled and unskilled people, again, as I said, coming in from the countryside. And what happened was there were so many of them, they created a surplus of labor. And when you have a surplus of labor, if you studied economics, you have low wages. You have more workers than you need, you can control the wages. And so these wages were barely above subsistence level. A lot of people could barely live on what they were making. And if work dried up, or if it was seasonal, and that was often the case, men were laid off. And they had no savings to fall back on because it was impossible to save. You couldn't save if you were just living hand to mouth to begin with. Henry Mayhew was an investigative journalist, and he wrote a series of articles about the way the poor of London lived and worked. And his articles were later published in a book, a really seminal work that is still used to this day, and I put it in your reading list, called London Labor and the London Poor. And it's one of the key books to go to for this time period. And in the introduction, he wrote, "The condition of a class of people whose misery amidst," oh, typo there, sorry, "all the immense wealth and great knowledge of the first city in the world is, to say the very least, a national disgrace to us." So he really highlighted what was going on with the London poor at this time and the working conditions that they were living under. So speaking of work, Londoners at this time period would have held a variety of jobs. Many worked in factories or shipyards or railways. Some worked on construction. Others worked as shopkeepers, clerks, domestic workers, and child labor was rampant during this time period. And the working conditions were often very, very dangerous for both children and adults. In fact, death and injury for children and adults alike was very common on the job. Labor and employment laws were scarce at the beginning of this time period, but they did change later to include legislation that limited the number of working hours, limited the minimum age for employees. You know, this was a time at the start of this era, you had children as chimney sweeps, and they were little kids, so you could put them down the chimneys very easily. They had children as young as 4 years old doing this work. So they started putting in legislation where you had to be a minimum age to work, and they started setting in place safety standards. Although a lot of these were still, a lot of this legislation was still pretty inadequate. It wasn't uncommon to work 7 days a week leading up into the Victorian era. And it wasn't until the early 19th century, everybody started having Sundays off, more or less everybody. That was kind of a given. And by the late 1890s, near the end of our period, most workers gained a half a day off on Saturdays as well. So again, not everybody. Some people continue to work 7 days a week, but most people had at least Sunday off, and some had a half a day on Saturday by the time we get to the end of this period. But paid time off was very scarce. Most workers had no paid leave, although in the 1870s, some clerks and skilled workers began to have weekly paid holidays. So it just depended where you worked, what you did for a living. And in 1871, we saw the Bank Holiday Act, and this gave workers, most workers, not all again, a few paid holidays each year. So let's talk about this. This act was introduced by the man on the left here, Sir John Lubbock, and it compelled banks to close on certain days, making them public holidays. In effect, it became a public holiday. In England and Wales, Easter Monday, Whit Monday, which was the day after Pentecost, the first Monday in August, and Boxing Day, the day after Christmas, these all became public holidays. Now, Lubbock was a member of Parliament. He was also a banker and a social reformer, and he thought it was time for people to enjoy some extra time off, courtesy of the British government. And in putting forward this act, this allowed citizens to enjoy the kind of state-sanctioned holidays. The number of bank holidays did vary by nation. So England, Wales, and Northern Ireland had about 4. Scotland had 5. Almost all of them were celebrated on Mondays. And for many Victorians, the bank holiday offered opportunities for families to get together, and workers saw these holidays as a welcome break, basically from the daily grind that they were living through. And not surprisingly, the August bank holiday became very popular because the weather was good. You could go to the seaside, as you see here on the right here, this photo on the right. So the August one became very popular, and there was kind of a running joke. I don't know how true it is. Lubbock supposedly played for a cricket team in his village, and they had some kind of big competition or a big yearly event in August. So one of the jokes was, oh yeah, he picked an August bank holiday so he wouldn't have to work, so he could go play cricket. Now, the first new holiday to be held under this act in 1871 was already a traditional holiday for many people. That was Whit Monday, so some people did already get that off. But August turned out to be the very first one officially, aside from Whit Monday. Reynolds newspaper at the time reported that the name of Sir John Lubbock and the first Monday in August will henceforth be associated with pleasant recollections in the minds of the clerks of the bankers, brokers, merchants, and traders of the city of London. Government offices did remain open. Warehouses, other offices, factories, and many shops were closed. 4 times as many trains as usual left from London for the Kent seaside in this August holiday, because again, everyone wanted to go to the seaside. And towns along the River Thames and attractions such as the London Zoo, they became very popular destinations during the August bank holiday. And the same newspaper that I quoted a minute ago, they were very pleased to note that there was, and I quote, not a tipsy or ill-conducted person to be seen among the holiday folk returning home at the end of the day. So again, not a universal holiday. Some government offices were open. Some people still had to work. Different countries got different numbers of these. In Manchester, the banks and warehouses closed, but the cotton mills remained open. And the industrial classes generally were at work as usual. So it was still kind of a mixed bag, but it was the kind of precursor to what we know of the bank holidays in England today, in the UK today. Housing. Not surprisingly, there was obviously a great divide between the classes when it came to housing. And we spoke a little bit last week. I referenced the kind of new terraced housing that was being built in London and the fact that London was spreading out to the suburbs more. Most homes were heated with coal fires. People cooked on coal burning stoves when this era started. By the 1870s, most houses had gaslight, and also by this time period, most middle-class homes had indoor bathrooms, but working-class homes still had the outdoor privy out in the yard. Housing for the poor, of course, was dismal. Again, due to this huge influx of workers into London, housing became very scarce. It was expensive, the same way wages were driven down by too many workers. The cost of living someplace went up because the demand was so high for it. And we also saw, again, the continued building of railways and new roads, and this demolished many existing, what they called slums, where the working class were living. But this only further exacerbated the housing problem. In the early 19th century, when we're talking about the beginning of this era, London, as I said, was growing and growing and growing, and pressure on housing increased. So any open space, remnants of market gardens, marshy meadows, anything that had not previously been profitable for building on, the grounds of former farmhouses, you name it, they became valuable land for developers. And these developers built on the cheap. They would just throw up super cheap housing and, just to make money. They didn't care. The land was usually leased for 21 years. So what this meant was builders had it for 21 years. And they had every incentive, therefore, to just put up really shoddy housing. They didn't care if it lasted over 20 years because their lease was going to run out anyway. So they threw these up fast. They threw these up cheap. Many of these houses had no foundations. They had dirt floors. Their walls were often just half a brick thick. That's how poorly they were built. The yards, the streets around them were all unpaved. There were no drains. So basically, these places became slums almost before they were finished being built. It was a travesty. And even then, many people living in these areas, they could not afford the rents that were being charged because, again, these slumlords could charge a lot of money. So people would end up renting out space in their own room. They might only be renting, a whole family could be renting one room, and they would still rent out to sublet, if you will, to other lodgers to try to afford the rent of that one room. In his book, The Victorian Underworld, Kello Chesney gave a very graphic description of the conditions in which many were living. And he said, hideous slums, some of them acres wide, some no more than crannies of obscure misery. 30 or more people of all ages may inhabit a single room. So you can tell it was pretty miserable. And not surprisingly, because of this, homelessness was also a really big problem at this time. And one of the first homeless shelters to open was run by the Salvation Army, and that was founded in 1865. And one of their first efforts to provide shelter for the homeless were these things called coffin houses. And basically, you could rent a space to sleep in basically a wooden box that looked like a coffin. And you can see on both sides here the Burn Street Hostel around 1900, and these coffin boxes all lined up. And then on the right, this shelter in London, run by the Salvation Army, and you can see how the men are in these, what they called them four-penny coffins, because you could sleep for a night for 4 pennies in one of these wooden boxes. So this led in the 1860s to philanthropic societies beginning to build model housing. And these were basically blocks of tenements, mainly in London, where working people could rent flats. Some large factory owners also built their own model housing estates for employees. And one example of these philanthropic societies who were doing this was the Guinness Trust. This was started by the great-grandson of the founder of the Guinness Brewery. The trust is still in existence to this day. They still work on social issues, affordable housing, and other issues for people in the community. This plaque denotes a Guinness Trust building that was founded in 1892, now in Chelsea, which ironically is a very upscale area of London. But there are still Guinness Trust. You can see these plaques around London, and there are still Guinness Trust initiatives underway today to help with housing and other social issues. So childhood, as with everything else, as with other times we looked at, you had children who lived quite well in this era and some who did not. Child mortality rates soared, with 75% of children dying before the age of 5 years old when we are coming into this time period. Mortality was obviously very, very high among the poor, but the death rate was not limited to this segment of society because, as we'll see later, still a lot of disease. Medicine was still pretty primitive in some ways at this time. So children often died very young. Now, many children lived with their parents in poverty, poor children did, but there were numerous homeless, destitute children living on the streets of London. Many were turned out of their homes and left to fend for themselves at an early age. Some ran away because of ill treatment. And in 1848, Anthony Ashley Cooper, he was a politician and another social reformer, he referred to more than 30,000, and I quote, naked, filthy, roaming, lawless, and deserted children in and around the metropolis. And you can see some photos here. So on the left, this is obviously a more well-to-do family. The girls are well dressed. They've got toys around them. And then you can see the absolute abject poverty in these other two photos. Now, as in medieval and Tudor Stuart London that we looked at earlier, children who did not have the advantage of being from well-to-do families, they were expected to help toward the family's income. And I mentioned earlier, these young boys would be employed as chimney sweeps. Some boys or children worked as they ran errands. The boys would be crossing sweepers, so they would sweep in the middle of the roads. Shoe blacks, shoe polishers. Children would sell matches, flowers, and other cheap goods on the street. And many destitute children lived by stealing, or if you were a girl, you went into prostitution. Many children worked 70 to 80 hours a week in very dangerous situations with little or no supervision or very little pay, and these would refer mostly to children working in factories. The photos you're seeing here, the one you see here and on the next slide or two, these are actually from textile mills in, I believe, South Carolina. These are in the United States. I could not find any good images from the UK, but very similar conditions as you can see. So these were very dangerous places for children to work in factories. And often what they would do is they would employ these little children to go underneath machinery in these textile mills and factories to retrieve cotton bobbins that had fallen. And the children would run under there to get the bobbins, and sometimes they'd get trapped in the machinery. So it was pretty horrendous, pretty horrendous. The Factory Act of 1833 restricted the working day in textile mills to 12 hours a day for persons aged 13 through 17 and 8 hours a day for children aged 9 through 12. So, I mean, think about this. Even a 9-year-old, you're working 8 hours a day, which is what we consider a standard workday for adults. So even though the Factory Act led to some improvements in conditions for these children, it was still legal to employ children as young as, 9 years old to work 8-9 hours a day, which is just incredible. This is another photo from one of these textile mills. I find this picture, I love this picture, but it's also disturbing. I mean, her eyes just look so haunted, I think. This is a very interesting and evocative photo of this young girl working in a factory. So a little bit about education and childhood. During the Victorian era, middle-class children went to grammar schools or they went to private academies. Younger, richer children were often taught at home by private tutors or a governess. And then when they were a bit older, the boys would go off to boarding schools. Poor children were obviously not afforded the luxury of an education because many of them went to work, as we saw, at a very young age. And any education that they may have gotten early on came through a Sunday school, usually. But as we get into the Victorian era and we start going a little further into the 1800s, education reform was underway. So in 1811, an effort was made to stem the tide of what was seen as immoral behavior. And the National Society for the Education of Poor Children, this is the long title actually, the full title is the National Society for the Education of Poor Children in the Principles of the Established Church of England. These were founded as national schools. They made these national schools, and according to their founders, poor children were to be taught to avoid vice and behave in an orderly manner within their station. And I underline within their station. So you knew where you belonged in society. Now, again, this was actually right before Victoria came to the throne, about 15, 20 years before Victoria came to the throne. So right before our period begins. And to limit the costs of running these schools, the system that they used in these national schools was they would have more advanced pupils teach the younger ones. And really, the main goal of these schools were not to give children any kind of broad education. It was to promote Anglican religious education. In 1840, charity schools were independently established to provide free education. And in most cases, they would provide food, clothing, lodging, some home services to the family if needed, for those who were too poor to pay. And these were often referred to as ragged schools. And again, education was substandard at best. We know in 1844, there were at least 20 of these schools, these ragged schools in London. And Charles Dickens visited one of these, the Field Lane Ragged School. He visited in 1843, and he said that this was an inspiration for him when he was writing A Christmas Carol. But over time, as we go on through this period, education came to be regarded as a universal need and a right. And so to achieve this goal, many state schools, new state schools were established, together with some church schools. And then we got the Elementary Education Act of 1870, and this was the first to provide for education for the whole population of England and Wales. But again, not all of these schools were free, and attendance was not mandatory. Compulsory education for children between the ages of 5 and 10 wasn't mandatory until later than this. By 1889, you did have to stay in school until you were 12 years old. And then 2 years later, the fee structure, any payment that any school said you had to pay, that was abolished and schools finally became free. And quite remarkably, by 1900, there was near universal literacy. And this really was a colossal achievement when you consider how appalling the situation of poor children had been if you go back to the beginning of the century. And now, by the end of the century, beginning of the new century, almost near universal literacy. So that was really wonderful. This is a picture of Bernardo's. These were famous, Bernardo's homes were famous. And again, they're still in existence today as well. They still work with children and young adults. But this was taken outside of a ragged school that Bernardo had founded with these children. So I mentioned that there were advancements in health, but health was still a big issue, and disease was still a big problem in London. London was still noisy, disease-ridden, it was polluted. We still saw, despite these growing medical innovations, infectious disease, these diseases were the greatest cause of Victorian mortality. And most of these were things like smallpox, tuberculosis, influenza. These had been around for a while. These weren't new. But in 1831, Britain suffered its first epidemic of cholera. So you've got all these other infectious diseases, and now cholera comes on the scene, and these kept life expectancy low. Middle-class men at this time period said they could live on, the average age was about 45 years old, which was quite young, especially by today's standards. And of course, workmen and laborers, people working in factories, often their life expectancy was even lower. And as I said before, children, their mortality rate was quite high before their 5th birthday. Now, we did see improvements come later in the century. There was better health care. There were innovations like chloroform. The stethoscope came in during this time period. More hospitals were being built. We saw some of those hospitals coming into the fore in the Georgian era even. And legislation mandating vaccines, which was really big to help stop the spread of disease as well. But as I said before, despite all of this, we did see a lot of poverty going on during this time period, a great deal of poverty. And again, Henry Mayhew, he described one London street with a tidal ditch running through it. And this is where the drains and sewers would be emptied into this ditch. And this ditch contained the only water people in the street had to drink. So again, led to the spread of a lot of diseases, especially cholera epidemics. There were cholera epidemics from 1832 to 1866. That finally resulted in the creation of a very expansive sewer system that we're going to talk about a little later. And also during this time, because of industrialization, we saw increased air pollution. So you had factories and their chimneys were burning coal and they were putting out this thick black dust. So the amount of suspended particulate matter that was in the air doubled over 2 centuries from the 1700s to the 1900s. So today, when you're reading these Victorian novels or you're watching films that were set in London during the Victorian era, that famous fog you always hear about was often the result of air pollution. Diet also played into health. In the early 19th century, the working class diet consisted of very kind of bland, plain food, things like bread, butter, potatoes, some bacon, butcher's meat, better cuts of meat. That was a luxury. Most people didn't eat that. But the diet did improve later into the 19th century, and this was due in part to railways that made it easier to import fresh fruits and vegetables more quickly from rural areas, bringing them in from the countryside, as well as steamships. Steamships were, a thing at this point, and that made it possible to import cheap grain from North America, for instance, so that made bread cheaper. And there were now refrigeration methods, and that made it possible to import cheap meat from places like all the way from Argentina and Australia. And this was also the time period when you started seeing long life products, so condensed milk, dried eggs, soups, bottled sauces, they became available. And Britain's first large scale meat canning factory, they were canning meat was I think set up in 1811. I think that was the first time there was any kind of meat canning factory, but the first large-scale meat canning factory was set up in 1865. And by the 1870s, because of all of this long life products and canned goods, now canning food became a thing. Almost every middle-class kitchen was said to have a can opener, so they could now have canned food. Levels of crime in London rose rapidly during the 18th century, period we talked about last time. And this was a major reason for poverty. And of course, that spilled over into the 19th century as well. So again, with an increase in population and greater wealth, there was more opportunity for criminal activity. More people had more money, poorer people didn't. Criminal activity ensued. Pickpockets, operated throughout the metropolis. You had highwaymen taking advantage of people traveling to and from London. Again, prostitution was rampant, lots of brothels and streetwalkers. And anyone that provided information leading to the arrest of a criminal could receive a reward. And basically, this led to something called thief takers, which basically were the precursor for private detectives, if you will. You catch a thief, you hunt down the thief, you catch him, you get a reward. Now, the organization of apprehending criminals actually began to improve in the middle of the Georgian period, the period we were talking about last time, notably with the appointment of the former playwright, barrister, and author Henry Fielding, who I mentioned last time. He was a justice of the peace at the Bow Street Magistrates Court, and he was made justice of the peace in 1748. So again, I'm going back to last week. That time period. And he organized a small number of constables called the Bow Street Runners. And this was the first step toward a professional police force in London. And then in 1829, right before our era begins, Sir Robert Peel, he was the Home Secretary at the time, he was responsible for the Metropolitan Police Act. And this provided permanently appointed and paid constables to protect London as part of the Metropolitan Police Force. And that's why you often got the nickname, I don't know that they really use it anymore, the policemen were called bobbies after Robert Peel, or peelers, sometimes peelers, but bobbies was popular. So basically, with this rise in crime and disorder, the main response was to increase the severity of punishment. So with children, even having the same punishment, the same level of punishment as adults, which seems quite harsh. And for the first time in history, prisons became the main form of punishment in this period. Hard labor was a common punishment. Many Victorians believed that having to work very hard would prevent criminals from committing crime in the future. And many criminals were sent to the penal colony of Australia for hard labor. Now, the law allowing this, shipping off prisoners to Australia, that changed in 1857. But there were still other forms of punishment floating around at this time. You could get fined, you could get hanged, or you could be sent to join the army. You could be forcibly sent to join the army. In 1854, special youth prisons were introduced to deal with child offenders, so they were not imprisoned with the adults. And these were called reformatory schools, and we still hear that term once in a while, reform schools. At least when I was growing up, that was still a thing. And I wanted to talk about debtors' prisons, and you can see here, this is a sign in Southwark on the south side of the river. This wall, behind this wall was the site of the old Marshalsea prison, a very infamous prison that closed in 1842. And it notes the fact here that Charles Dickens' father was imprisoned here for a while. So debtors' prisons. Um, this was a very notorious type of prison. Since the 14th century, debtors could end up in prison for non-payment of debts. So that had been going on for a very long time. And in the Victorian era, debtors who were not traders could be imprisoned indefinitely until their debt was repaid to creditors. You could avoid this by declaring bankruptcy, but only if you were a merchant or a trader. And even then, the cost was prohibitive. You had to pay £10, which was equivalent to about 10 to 20% of the average annual income for the common worker in the mid 1800s. So it wasn't cheap to declare bankruptcy, but you could do so. In many cases, it was hoped that the debtors' families and friends would repay the debt and keep the individual out of prison or get them out of prison quicker. Generally, the conditions in the prison depended on your standing in society. Now, if you recall way back when we were talking about the Tower of London, and I was saying, the prisoners held there even during the Tudor period, most of them were nobility. So they would actually have apartments. We think of them as having dungeons and being chained to walls and things. But really, most of them had rather nice furnishings. They could bring their staff with them, their servants with them. And in debtors' prisons, it was curious and very interesting. So it depended on your standing in society. The warden of the prison could charge or would charge actually for accommodations. These prisons were state-owned. They were subject to regulation, but they were operated for private profit, so for profit. So if you could afford it, accommodation allowed access to a bar and a shop, and you could even get day releases where you could go out during the day. And the idea was, okay, you can go out and potentially earn money to pay back your debt. But this concept of debtors' prisons it was really flawed from the start. Because look, for most people, if you were thrown into prison and you had no family, you had no friends or family to bail you out in the sense of paying your debt, the debt continued to accumulate. If you were paying interest on that debt, you were never going to get out because you couldn't work and you had nobody to help you out. So most people were really stuck there. And often the other thing that would happen is because usually the male was the one working, the mother was usually home with the children. So the father goes into prison, debtor's prison. Well, who's going to pay the rent now? Who's going to put food in these children's mouths, right? So whole families would move into these prisons with the debtor because they couldn't afford to live outside anymore. And these places were often very overcrowded, they were cold, they were damp. As I said, Charles Dickens' own father spent time in Marshalsea prison. That prison was said to have had very primitive and cruel conditions. And sometimes you would see someone in prison for up to 30 years or more because they couldn't pay off their debt. It was just an impossible situation. They were in a catch-22. And it wasn't until the Bankruptcy Act of 1869 that these prisons were finally closed. So finally, they were shut down and closed. Workhouses was another institution during this time. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 was intended to curb the cost of poor relief and address abuses of the old system. And basically, they did this by saying, okay, we're going to give relief, but only if you come into the workhouse. And they made sure that the conditions in the workhouse were such that people really didn't want to come into the workhouse. The conditions were so bad. So they were trying to deter people from getting this kind of relief from the government at all. So often what you'd end up seeing is orphaned, elderly, sick, disabled, those who really couldn't find work, who were beyond desperation, they were the ones that ended up in the workhouse. Now, poorhouses or houses of industry, as they were called, they had existed for several centuries across Britain. By 1776, over 16,000 individual men, women, and children were housed in one of 80 workhouses in London. So again, we're going back to the Georgian era because I couldn't cover all of this last time. And that was roughly at that time, about 1 to 2% of the population of London in 1776 were in workhouses. But during our period, the Victorian era that we're talking about today, the 19th century, inner city workhouses were housing people on basically an industrial scale. And they grew hand in glove with the Industrial Revolution. So again, lots of people moving into urban areas to find work, couldn't find work, they were unemployed or they were injured on the job in a factory. They couldn't work after being injured. They found themselves in these workhouses. The men and women were separated when they entered the workhouses. And if you came in with children, you were only allowed to see your children for a few hours on a Sunday. The residents wore uniforms. You can see here all these ladies in the same garments. And medical provision was provided, but usually very, very poor. It was harsh. It was really harsh. One contemporary account said that in 1866, 556 people were sharing 332 beds, and the cubic footage of space available per person was half of that you would see in London prisons. We already know that London prisons weren't a great place to start with, so half of that space. Charlie Chaplin spent his formative years in a South London workhouse. It was called the Cleveland Street Workhouse, one of the earliest surviving workhouses in London, stone's throw away from Charles Dickens' childhood home. And again, it was supposedly one of his influences for writing Oliver Twist. So as the century progressed, many people and various agencies became increasingly concerned about the scale of poverty in society. But one of the challenges of dealing with it were contemporary attitudes. So many people still regarded the poor as weak and lazy. They were seen to have wasted their money on drink and on gambling. And worse still, there was this prevailing attitude at this time that God had created a social order. Remember, I mentioned this earlier with the children's education, knowing where to stay. You don't get outside of your station. You know where your station is. So there was still this belief that God had a social order for everybody. However, as we've seen, a lot of social reform started coming up. A lot of philanthropy was undertaken during this time period. Campaigners like Charles Dickens did much to kind of highlight the plight of the poor in London. And of course, Dickens did it through his novels. So he was spreading knowledge to the literate classes, to say, look, what's happening here. Not that you couldn't see it in front of your eyes in some cases, but he was really highlighting this. And many charitable institutions, as we've seen, some that are still in existence today, a lot of them grew out of this movement at this time. And yeah, we talked about that. So the Foundling Hospital, this was one very interesting institution that again had its foundations in the Georgian era, but this is quite an interesting one. And today there is a Foundling Museum that you can visit. Again, very few people know about this. I would highly recommend a visit here the next time you're in London. So the Foundling Hospital had its beginnings, as I said, in the Georgian period. And there was a man named Thomas Coram, and he was an English philanthropist. And he had spent many years in America establishing and running shipyards. And he returned to London in 1704, and he was shocked to discover destitute and dying children on London's streets. Now, a lot of these parents were unable to care for their infants due to poverty, or the children were illegitimate. And they had few options. Parents had few options at this time. Many abandoned their children on the street, as we saw later in the Victorian era. And it was estimated that about 1,000 children a year were abandoned in London in the early 1700s. So clearly there was a need for something to be done, and Coram tried to address this. So he petitioned the king for a charter, and he said, I want to create a foundling hospital, and I want to have it supported by private subscriptions, so people would pay to protect these children. At first, he found it impossible to get the backing of anybody influential. Again, there was this, this idea, prevailing idea that the poor were lazy, and also illegitimacy was really frowned on. So these children were not seen as being worthy. But Coram spent 17 years campaigning for this, and he finally received a royal charter from George II in 1739, and he established his foundling hospital. Now, instrumental in helping him meet this vision were two people, the artist William Hogarth, who we talked about last time when we looked at Gin Lane and Beer Street, and the composer George Friedrich Handel. So Hogarth encouraged the leading artists of the day, his friends, to donate their works. And they established basically the UK's first really public art gallery. I mentioned when we were talking about Vauxhall Gardens that some of Hogarth's works would be hanging up in there. and that was like the first public gallery. But this was really a public gallery where people could come in, pay, and see these works. Handel donated an organ, and he conducted annual benefit concerts of the Messiah in the hospital's chapel, again to raise money. From 1741, when the first babies were admitted, to 1954, when the last pupil was placed into foster care, the Foundling Hospital cared for and educated around 25,000 children. And again, this came about poverty, widowhood, desertion, babies born out of wedlock. These were all reasons that mothers were leaving their babies at this hospital. And when they did so, they were required to leave an identifying token. And the idea was the baby comes into the home, the name gets changed, and mother may or may never come back, but say the mother comes back 7 years later, she might not recognize her child doesn't recognize her because the child came as an infant. So there was supposed to be an identifying token that was clipped to the child's paperwork. And some children didn't even have names when they were left, so that was the problem too. So some people left three-dimensional objects, or they left written notes if they were literate. But for the majority, what it would be was a piece of fabric. So mom would have a piece of the fabric, and part of the fabric went with the baby's record. And the museum's archive has about 5,000 pieces, and they have several of these on display, including this one that I took this photo of. It almost looks like a little purse, but you can see the initials MD on here. And that was an identifying token. Had the mother ever come back, she would have claimed the child through that token. She would have recognized that token, said, that's my child. I can tell you that's my child. I can identify the token, or I've got the other piece of fabric, whatever. So there was, not surprisingly, an overwhelming demand for only a few hundred places in this Foundling Hospital. And again, looking at the Georgian era, between 1756 and 1760, the hospital was obligated to accept every baby brought to the hospital, and in exchange, they would get a grant from the government for every child they took in. But you saw admission rates soaring because of this. There were over 15,000 accepted babies from across the country, not just London. And many children died en route on their way to these hospitals. So then the hospital said, okay, we've got to start setting up petitions to grant places. We don't have room for all these children. So from 1801, only illegitimate babies were accepted, but the mothers had to prove that they were formally respectable women. How they proved that, I'm not sure. If they had to get character witnesses, what they had to do, but they couldn't be, in other words, you couldn't have lived your life as a poor woman who became a prostitute because you were never respectable. So your child could not make it into this institution. But the museum today is a fascinating place to visit. I would highly recommend it. Here is a picture of one of these petitions to place a child into the care of the Foundling Museum. Female child, said that who the father was, and when the father was last seen. So the father deserted the mother, and they're begging to let the child in. And then here are some of the girls. This is, to me, a striking photograph, again, not only because they're all in uniforms, which you kind of expect, but they almost all have the same haircut. They all got not quite all of them, but almost all of them have the same haircut across the board. So that's poverty and childhood and work. And again, I spilled over from the Georgian period into the Victorian era. Now I want to talk about some innovations that went on. And I want to start with the Great Exhibition. And this was the Great Exhibition of 1851, or the formal title, the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations. Now, again, late Georgian, early Victorian, we saw a lot of civil engineering. This was not a civil engineering project per se, but this exhibition really had a lasting impact on London. It was held inside this enormous structure of iron and glass that was called the Crystal Palace. It covered 19 acres in Hyde Park. And over 5 months, from May to October 1851, 6 million visitors came in and visited this. It was a trade show, basically, of technological inventions. Everything from massive steam engines, the latest cameras. And the idea for this came about with a guy named Henry Cole. He was an artist and an inventor. And Prince Albert backed it. He got on board with it. And he recognized the value of organizing this massive show that would place Britain at the forefront of technology. He wanted to show off what Britain could do. At the end of the exhibition, a selection of objects was purchased using a treasury grant to create what later became the first incarnation of the Victoria and Albert Museum. And the first director of the Victoria and Albert Museum was Henry Cole. The Crystal Palace was moved to another location, became a permanent attraction until it burned down in 1936. But back to the V&A, the Victoria and Albert, when the museum opened in 1852, it was called the Museum of Manufacturers. And it was intended to kind of show off contemporary architecture and design, to educate designers and manufacturers, and to educate the public in art and design. So originally it was in Marlborough House. This was a royal residence in London, and that was gifted to them by Prince Albert. But by 1854, the museum had outgrown its space already, and didn't matter if it had, because the Prince of Wales at the time, later Edward VII, wanted it for his own home. So Henry Cole went back to Prince Albert. He said, okay, what can we do? We need a permanent museum. And so they decided they wanted it near the site of the Crystal Palace. They purchased, the Royal Commission purchased from the profits from the Great Exhibition, purchased this house and gardens, this big area, Brompton House, and they decided that this would be the space that they would have the museum in. They erected a building. The house was kind of falling apart. They erected a building for the new museum. It was a temporary structure, kind of an ugly structure. And then the building went through several iterations, and it encompassed basically several additional separate buildings. It was all kind of hodgepodge. And then in 1891, Aston Webb, who was a relatively young architect, he was selected to take charge of this and bring cohesion to this area with all these awkward kind of buildings and gaps and decaying houses left over. And he created this magnificent frontage in red brickwork, and it had stone dressings and terracotta dressings, very beautiful. And he wanted, and you can see here in the courtyard, he wanted long galleries that would extend along Cromwell Road with a 3-story octagon surmounted by a small cupola, and then a large courtyard. So in May of 1899, in what was to be her last public ceremony, Queen Victoria laid the foundation stone for Aston Webb's new museum. The occasion also marked the changing of the museum's name to the Victoria and Albert Museum. That's when it got its name. The Queen wanted it called the Albert Museum, but she was persuaded to change her mind. She laid the foundation stone in 1899, and the museum finally opened in 1909. It is a masterpiece. Just the building itself is just a masterpiece, never mind what's in it. I want to point out in the courtyard these touching little tributes. One is in memory to Tycho, a faithful dog who died on the 5th of January, and I forgot my Roman numerals, so I can't tell you what year that was, but I believe that dog was belonged to the son of Henry Cole. But on the right, you do see here in memory of Jim, who died in 1879, aged 15 years, faithful dog of Sir Henry Cole. And these two plaques are just kind of stuck in a wall, kind of off on the side in the courtyard there. Love this museum. Whenever I'm in London for an extended period, if it's a really rainy day and I have nothing else to do, I'll just go over and kill a few hours in the museum. It's a fascinating place. Okay, the London Underground. The first underground railway in London was completed in 1863, running from Paddington to Farringdon Road, and it was so successful that other lines soon followed. Today, there are 11 lines, 272 stations, covering a total of 250 miles, and they handle up to 5 million passengers per day. So this was another innovation that came in smack in the middle of the Victorian era. This is I don't know how I managed to get a shot with nobody on these escalators. This is at Swiss Cottage, the Swiss Cottage underground stop. And I love it because I love that what they call the uplighting, these lamps that are pointing up, the lights pointing up, and the way out sign, the Rondo way out sign is quite cool. And the very first, the oldest underground station is Baker Street. And again, really a cool place to get pictures of these amazing windows. Now I'm flying through some of this, I realize, because there is a lot of technological stuff I wanted to mention. I mentioned cholera, so I want to get back to this. In the mid-1800s, a combination of coal-fired stoves and really poor sanitation made the air really foul smelling. And we've talked about in the past, that didn't smell good in the medieval era either. But in the early Victorian period, disposal of human waste hadn't progressed much since medieval times. So chamber pots were still being emptied into streets. And the advent of flush toilets really didn't help matters either, because you had indoor toilets, but they were feeding into these large cesspools. And at some point, the cesspools were closed, and you'd have this raw sewage that was dumped straight into the Thames, as well into channels that fed into the city's drinking water. And then, as I said, you started seeing these cholera epidemics. The cholera epidemic of 1848-49 claimed over 14,000 lives, and the next year, another epidemic killed nearly 11,000 people. And at this time, because of the way the air smelled, there was this belief that cholera was spread through the air. So there was no connection to filthy drinking water at this point. And it wasn't until 1854 that Dr. John Snow documented the high mortality rate from cholera, and he traced it back to users of water from a particular water pump in Broad Street. And that's when it was discovered that cholera was spread by water. But even then, he was not initially believed. People didn't initially believe him. So why did they finally decide to address this issue? Well, in 1858, the temperature in London rose to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And obviously, that made the Thames even stinkier than it had been. Pretty much the Thames had kind of become a toilet by this period, to be quite honest about it. Really bad. And that summer was known as the Great Stink. And sitting right next to the river was the new Houses of Parliament, the Palace of Westminster. And this is where Parliament met. And on the 30th of June of that summer, during a committee meeting, the smell of the river was so bad, Benjamin Disraeli, who was then the Chancellor of the Exchequer, he was said to have jumped up, he grabbed his papers, he threw a handkerchief over his mouth, and he ran out of the building. He was followed by all his fellow politicians, and they were all choking. So no surprise, once this stinky, foul smell in the river affected politicians personally, they said, oh, something has to be done about this. Now we have to do something. So the image on the left here you see is Sir Michael Faraday. He's a scientist. He was one of the first to recognize that there was a big pollution problem in the Thames, and you can see him holding his nose and giving his card to Father Thames. And the image on the right is from Punch magazine, and it is showing Death's Dispensary, so this cholera-ridden water that people are drinking from this pump. Here is Dr. John Snow on the left, and a replica of the pump, the Broad Street pump, that is now outside the John Snow pub. Not the real pump, but a replica of it. So what did they do to address all of this? Well, an act was passed to clean up the river, and the task was handed to the recently created Metropolitan Board of Works. That board was founded in 1856, and it was headed by the chief engineer, the man on the right here, Joseph Bazalgette. 82 miles of brick-lined sewer interceptors were constructed parallel to the river. Waste and surface water from 1,100 miles of old street sewers, which had previously drained directly into the Thames or its tributaries, they now went into these interceptors. And where these sewers ran on each side of the river, they were hidden in massive embankments at Westminster and Chelsea, which are to this day gardens and river walkways. Now, this narrowed the width of the river considerably. And we've talked about before the river being much wider in earlier times. So what this did was it increased the flow of the water. It increased the flow, the ability to cleanse the riverbed. Of course, we no longer saw the freezing of the Thames the same way. And in 1861, an act required local authorities to purify any sewage before discharging it into rivers and canals. So what came out of this? Dramatic drop in cholera after this was finished. It was a huge undertaking, and these Victorian sewers are still the backbone of London's sewer system today, although some of them are getting quite clogged up. And as an aside, in addition to this great contribution of narrowing the river, of this embankment project, the sewer project, Bazalgette also oversaw the creation of new bridges across the Thames. Actually, Hammersmith Bridge was the one that he designed. And I wanted to point this out too, because this was designed by Bazalgette and the architect Charles Henry Driver. This is one of the pumping stations for the sewage. This is the Crossness pumping station. It was built in 1865. It's about 12 miles east of central London on the Thames. It's described by one prominent architectural historian, as a Victorian cathedral of ironwork. It is absolutely jaw-dropping for what its purpose was, for anything, never mind what its purpose was. It was shut down in the early 1950s, but it was conserved. The building was conserved. It's overseen by a charitable trust, and it is open for visitors on certain days of the year. And boy, if you're there when you can get in to see this, it is an amazing sight to see. It's so high Victorian Gothic, and it's a pumping station. It was a pumping station for sewage, but quite amazing. Okay, another engineering feat, if you will, Tower Bridge. This is obviously a very iconic landmark of London. It's often mistaken for London Bridge. In 1876, the City of London Corporation held a competition. They said, we really need a new river crossing downstream of London Bridge, but it was essential that this bridge would not disrupt river traffic. So more than 50 designs were submitted, and it wasn't until 1884 that this kind of suspension bridge with these levers that open, these leafs, if you will, that open in the middle. This design was accepted. It was the design of Sir Horace Jones and Sir John Wolfe Barry. So their design was taken. It took 8 years to build this, 5 major contractors and 432 construction workers working round the clock each day, 15,000 tons of iron, 31 million bricks, and 6,000 gallons of paint went into building this. It is 800 feet long. You've got these 213 feet towers on each side built on piers. The central span is about 200 feet, which is, quite, traffic can pass through there very well. Those levers, those kind of leaves, they were raised by huge hydraulic pumps. At first, they were powered by coal-burning steam engines, but they were replaced by electricity and oil, not until 1976. And the total cost of construction was about, what we would say, about $3 million in today's money. So I would say money well spent. It was the largest and most sophisticated bridge of its type at that time. And between the towers are 2 high level walkways that pedestrians can cross, even when the bridge deck is raised, even when those kind of leaves are up. You can also see the original pumping engines in the Victorian engine room. You can tour that at the Tower Bridge. And the bridge is open about at least 700 times a year, sometimes 4 or 5 times a day. There's a website where you can go online and find the opening times. And in 2014, the bridge added a glass-floored walkway at the top. So if you're not afraid of heights, you can walk up there and you can look down and see the traffic below you. And here are some photos of the bridge under construction. I love this one. Okay, a little bit about architecture. Let's see how far we get. St. Pancras Station. This was designed by William Henry Barlow. It is built in the Gothic Revival style from red brick. Again, an absolutely jaw-breakingly beautiful building, in my opinion. It has a single-span train shed roof. This was the largest cast iron and glass structure of its type at the time. And connected to the train station is the St. Pancras Hotel. Now I think it's called the Renaissance Hotel, maybe. Equally impressive. It was designed by Giles Gilbert Scott to front the station. The outside is magnificent. I snuck inside. You can't go inside the hotel unless you're a guest there or a resident. They do have some apartments in there. But if you're in the train station, there is a restaurant, a bar restaurant. And if you go through the bar restaurant and out the other side of the door, you are in the hotel. And I snuck in one day because it has an iconic staircase that well, first of all, here's the ceiling. I took this from inside the hotel, actually. But there you can see that span and you can see the train station. I obviously took these during the 2012 Summer Olympics because you can see the Olympic rings. And this is the staircase that I wanted to get. So I snuck inside. There were 2 other people in there who had figured out how to get in here. And I knew I shouldn't have gone beyond this point, but I went partway up the stairs because I was trying to get a shot down. And all of a sudden I heard this very stern Eastern European accented voice say, "Are you staying here?" And I turned around and said, no, very timidly. And we all looked kind of scared. The two guys who were also down on the stairs, they weren't staying there. And this man said, follow me. And he put us on an elevator, and we were all looking at each other going, oh my God, what are we going to get thrown out of here, I guess. And he was a maintenance guy, and he proceeded to give us a 45-minute tour of the entire hotel with all of its history. And it was absolutely amazing. We got to go up on the roof terrace. It was amazing what he showed us. So here are some more pictures that I was lucky enough to get. He was very patient while I took photos. The one on the right is from the roof terrace. You get a nice view over to King's Cross Station. Amazing, amazing train station and a beautiful hotel. One that I can never afford to stay in, but beautiful. Now, you heard me mention the Palace of Westminster, and you might recall that there was a palace on this site from the medieval period. In the 1500s, a fire destroyed a large portion of the palace, and that was the time when Henry VIII, if you recall, moved over to York Place, which later became Whitehall Palace. That became his residence. And over time, this was given over to Parliament, this building, the one that had burned and was later restored. But on the night of the 16th of October, 1834, a devastating fire broke out here after two underground stoves set fire to paneling in the Lord's chamber. And the fire quickly spread through the entire palace, destroyed many of the buildings. It was the largest fire in London, apart from the Great Fire of 1666 and the Blitz during the Second World War. So in 1870, they built this one, the Palace of Westminster. It was built by Charles Barry, and he was very good at blending the old with the new because there were still some surviving medieval parts of the palace left. Westminster Hall, you recall we looked at that when we looked at medieval London. The cloisters and the chapter house from St. Stephen's were still there, and the Undercroft Chapel were still there. So he made sure he incorporated all of this together. And you can see here the iconic on the right-hand side, the Elizabeth Tower. Everyone thinks this is the tallest tower. It is not the tallest tower, better known as Big Ben, obviously, for the bell in there. The tallest one is actually over on the far left. That is the Victoria Tower, named after Queen Victoria, designed as a royal entrance. So the gateways of the tower were built wide enough to allow the Queen's coach to drive through for the state opening of Parliament. By tradition, this route is the only one the sovereign is allowed to take when he or she comes to the House of Lords. And there are steps leading up from there, known as the Royal Staircase. It's part of the processional route for the monarch to go to the state opening of Parliament. And until a few years prior to her death, Queen Elizabeth II walked up those stairs every time she opened Parliament. Last few years of her life, she used an elevator that was alongside the stairs. This is what the Houses of Parliament that Westminster Palace looked like before the fire. Okay. Moving on, and going back to Prince Albert, the Royal Albert Hall. This was built on what was once the Gore estate. And after the Great Exhibition, on the advice of Prince Albert, Gore House and its grounds were purchased again by the Exhibition's Royal Commission because Prince Albert had this vision. He wanted to create a cultural quarter, a cultural center around here. And you see that today. You see that with the Victorian Albert Museum, with the Royal Albert Hall. We're going to look at, if we have time, the Natural History Museum. So he had a vision for this. 7,000 people came to watch Queen Victoria, who had rarely been seen in public since Prince Albert died. He died in 1861. She laid the granite foundation stone, and today you can still see that foundation stone if you go into the Royal Albert Hall. It's underneath the K stalls. It's in row 11 and right underneath seat 87, and you can see the foundation stone. It's built in this Italianate style of architecture, which was very popular during this time period. And it had the world's first domed amphitheater. So it was built like an amphitheater, but it had this incredible dome around there. It's mostly red brick. A mosaic frieze that encircles the building is 800 feet long. And it's got these mosaics depicting the triumph of the arts and sciences. And they're in like 16 different allegorical groups. And then you have terracotta letters that are inscribed 12 inches above the frieze. And these combine historical and religious quotations. The dome is freestanding. It reaches a height of 135 feet, and it's made of iron and glass, and it weighs 800 tons. And in 1969, they wanted to improve the acoustics of the building, so they put in these fiberglass discs that were dubbed mushrooms or flying saucers. They had 135 of these installed, and then in 2001, they removed 50 of them, and they reconfigured 85 others to, again, give a better acoustic sound quality in the hall. And they were deemed so successful that the Sydney Opera House followed suit and used these as well. Originally, 8,000 people could fit in here, or capacity was 8,000, but with new safety restrictions, now 5,544. A couple other pictures of it. It's quite grand inside. I got to go to the Olivier Awards here several years ago. And then a couple days later, we were given a tour of the building. And this was during the awards, and you can see these what they call the mushrooms or the flying saucers. Okay, so right across the street is the Albert Memorial, right across from the hall. It is a very ornate monument designed by George Gilbert Scott. It was unveiled in 1872, commemorating the death of Prince Albert. He died of typhoid fever when he was only 42. It is really high Victorian Gothic extravaganza. There's no other way to describe it. It's officially titled the Prince Consort National Memorial. And basically it celebrates Victorian achievement and Prince Albert's passions and interests. So he's holding here the exhibition catalog of the Great Exhibition of 1851. And you can see again, gilding and mosaics and just amazing. And there's a close-up, not very good. Got kind of blurry when I blew it up, but you can see him holding the catalog. And then you have these marble figures, and they represent Europe, Asia, Africa, America. They're at each corner of the memorial. And then as you go higher up, you've got figures that are representing manufacturing and commerce and agriculture and engineering. And then near the very top, there are gilded bronze statues of angels and virtues. So it really, it pops out when you walk by it. Now, this is something, I wanted to close with a few things that one of these, you've probably seen these if you've walked around London. These are cabman shelters. And the Cabman Shelter Fund was established in London in 1875. And this was to run shelters for the drivers of horse-drawn carriages known as hansom cabs. And then later for the more modern taxi cabs. Now, by law, cab drivers could not leave the cab stand while their cabs were parked there. So this made it very difficult for them to get something to eat. And if they were, especially when they were the hansom cabs, the horse-drawn carriages, pretty miserable in cold, wet weather when you're sitting there. So a charity was established to construct and run these kind of shelters at these major cab stands. Small green huts, as you can see here, they could not be larger than a horse and cart, and they stood on the public road. Between 1875 and 1914, 61 of these were built around London, and most were staffed by an attendant who would sell food and non-alcoholic beverages to the cabbies. They also provided seating and tables. They had books and magazines. They could hold about 10 to 13 cabbies, but gambling, drinking, and swearing were strictly prohibited. You'd be thrown out. Now, during World War I, drivers and their vehicles were drafted into the war, so cabs and these shelters, cabs started disappearing, shelters went into decline, basically. And over time, the wooden huts began to rot. Some were destroyed by bombs during World War II, others were bulldozed to widen streets. But 13 of these still exist today. 10 are still in operation. Some are just for cab drivers, but some, as you can see here, I think this one was someplace in Knightsbridge. I can't remember where I took this. But you can see the general public, and these guys were construction workers working on a construction site nearby. You can just line up and go to the takeout window and get something to eat here. They are owned by the Worshipful Company of Hackney Carriage Drivers. So one of those worshipful companies that go all the way back to the medieval guilds. And they're still run by the Cabins Shelter Fund, and they're now all grade 2 listed buildings, so they cannot be damaged, destroyed, or moved. And here's a shot of the inside of one. Okay, quickly, because I'm aware that we're running out of time. The Natural History Museum, right across from the V&A. It is a building that's almost as beautiful as a cathedral, speaking of architecture. First opened in 1881, but its origins stretch back to the British Museum and Sir Hans Sloane, who we talked about last time. Now, if you'll recall, he left a lot of his items his items were, his collection was part of what started the British Museum. And in 1864, an architect who worked on the Royal Albert Hall and part of the Victorian Albert Museum, he won a competition to design what later became the Natural History Museum. He died unexpectedly a year later, and Alfred Waterhouse took over and came up with this amazing, amazing site here in South Kensington. He used terracotta for the entire building because he said, well, terracotta is more resistant to Victorian London's harsh climate. So that's why we were seeing terracotta. This building is really a striking example of Romanesque architecture. It's considered a work of art in its own right. It's become one of London's most iconic landmarks. The museum was actually, this separate building was part of the British Museum until 1963, when a separate board of trustees was appointed. But it wasn't officially renamed the Natural History Museum until the early 1990s. So it was part of the British Museum until then, until 63, and then didn't get this name until I think 1992. But I love going in here and just taking photos. Forget the the collection's great, but collection aside, it is just inside and out a stunning piece of architecture. Okay, two more places. And both of these, a lot of people do not know about, and they're so well worth a quick visit to. The Fitzrovia Chapel. This is an amazing little chapel. This was created for the then Middlesex Hospital. Remember last week we were talking about those hospitals that were founded in Georgia and London, and one of them I said the only one still not in existence in any form was the Middlesex, but I said don't forget that name. This is why, because of this chapel. It was originally built by John Pearson with a timber roof, but in 1929, Pearson's son Frank, he had been influenced by mosaics that he saw in St. Mark's in Venice. So he added a vaulted ceiling and he covered it in mosaics. This little chapel was restored in 2013. It's now open to visitors, but only on Wednesdays between 11 a.m. and 4 p.m. A little hard to find. It's tucked down a little side alley. I did put the address in there, but I had to sort of hunt around a little bit for it. These pictures that you're going to see do not do justice. I could not capture the absolute jaw-dropping beauty of this place. But here are some photos from the inside. It is just covered in marble and mosaics. It is just, I wish my photos looked better because it is absolutely stunning. So again, I would highly recommend a visit to this. They do rent it out now for private parties and weddings and things like that, but it is amazing. And then the last one that I wanted to mention that a lot of people don't know about as well, this is a place called Postman's Park. It's just north of St. Paul's Cathedral. It's a little garden. It's tucked away between two streets. Again, a little hard to find. The park itself was named for the building at the southern end of the garden, which once housed the General Post Office. The park was opened in 1880, and the garden was used by postal workers when they would take their tea breaks. They'd go over to the park and sit and have their tea. The park itself, the garden itself, pretty unremarkable space. There's not much to write about the space. It's quiet, it's pretty, but as a garden, it's really nothing special. What makes it stand out is a long covered structure at one end of the garden, and this structure is called the Watts Memorial to Heroic Self-Sacrifice, and it was built in 1900, and it was the brainchild of George Frederick Watts. And you can see here what it says here. The memorial contains 54 ceramic tiles, each recognizing individuals who lost their lives while trying to save others. And it really is a tribute to everyday heroes. Well, it's both artistically beautiful. It's incredibly moving, just reading these tiles and these stories. And to me, it's very, very touching that ordinary individuals, people that no one remembers, that nobody talks about except their families, are commemorated in these tiles. In total, there are 62 people commemorated, 8 children, 9 women, 45 men. The youngest individual commemorated was 8 years old, and the oldest, 61. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice at this point. The earliest date commemorated is 1863 on here. So they backdate, if you will, because this wasn't built till 1900. And most of the tiles reference incidences that occurred in the mid to the late 1800s, so in our time period. But there is one tile as recent as 2007. So here are just a couple of pictures of these tiles. A 17-year-old who died of her injuries when she was trying to save a child from a runaway horse. And then on the right here, the last tile, as I said, that dated to 2007. But they're stunningly beautiful. It's very moving. It's very peaceful in there. Nobody goes there. Nobody knows it's there. A lot of people don't know that it's even there. So again, if you're looking for something that is not the typical tourist sites, the Fitzrovia Chapel, the Postman's Park. I mean, the tourist sites are great. The V&A I love, the Natural History Museum I love. All the places I showed you, I mean, are wonderful. But these two, Fitzrovia Chapel and Postman's Park, are places I guarantee you most people don't even know about, and they are well worth seeking out. With that, and with my dying, oh, here's another, excuse me, I'm going to take a drink here. Some more of these tiles. So next week, we are going to move into the 20th century and the 21st century, constant change and evolution, but we're really going to focus on the war years, pageantry, and protests. So that's all next week. And now with what's left of my voice, I am going to see if I do see a lot of comments or questions in the chat. So let me get out of here. Go back to Zoom, stop my sharing, and go down to the chat. I would have to, Peter was asking how far out the city was included in these figures. By the 1800s, I'd have to find a map to show you. It was spreading out quite a bit by then, but I'm not sure how to define quite a bit for you without showing you a map of that. But definitely a lot of these little villages outlying kind of what were then little villages or suburbs got incorporated into Greater London at this time. So those would have been included. What is happening in your 1901 photo? I'll have to go back and see. I'm not sure which one that, no, that wasn't the one. I don't know. I'll have to go back and see which one you're referencing, Peter. As a child, Peter said he had to put a penny a week into the Bernardo's box. Very good. Okay, so they were still calling them bobbies when you left. Yeah, I don't think they're using that term much anymore, but I could be.
Deb, with regard to the 1901
Yeah, what picture was that?
photo, it was something about the housing, how poorly it was made.
Oh, it made all the people standing in the street?
Yeah, you had
Yeah.
the men and the boys at the front,
Right.
some women at the back, and
Those were,
a lot of personal possessions
yeah.
on the side. So is that a family or families being evicted?
Yes, they were being evicted. That was a photograph. Sorry, I didn't say that, but yes, that was a photograph of families being evicted from a particular area. So they were standing there again, very destitute. Where else do you go? Where else do you go? These landlords really took advantage of the situation to not only build very poor housing, but to charge so much at a time when nobody had anything, that they had very little opportunity to live, let alone try to advance themselves. But yes, those were families being evicted. Sorry about that. I should have mentioned that. Oh no, the V&A, boring. No, it's the nation's attic, Peter. I always find something. The V&A is to me absolutely fascinating because they'll have this amazing medieval collection, and then you go up a couple of flights, and they've got a collection of lunch pail, the little tin lunch buckets from the 1940s or 50s. I mean, anything and everything is in that museum, and I stay pretty close to there when I'm in London. So again, when it's raining and I don't feel like traipsing all over the place, maybe I'll go up to the V&A for a couple hours and just find yet another section of the museum to look at. But that's just me. I love that museum. And I'm not surprised that the Thames still was smelling downstream of the city in 1958. I'm sure it was. I don't doubt that for a minute. But yeah, I always thought it was quite typical and amusing that it wasn't until it affected the politicians that they're like, oh, gee, this thing really stinks. We have to do something about this. And it's a really good thing they did, because it did bring an end to the cholera epidemics. But now there is, what do they call it? The Fatbergs. The sewer system, that old Victorian sewer system, is now getting clogged up with something called fatbergs, which are just this kind of accumulated waste and fatty stuff that is clogging up some of the lines. And I forgot where they were in trying to address that now, but it has served them pretty well for a very, very long period of time, and created those very nice walkways along the river now. Other comments or questions? I'll put my video back on here. Okay. If there is nothing, as I said, every week I fly through this stuff because there is so much to cover and so little time to cover it in.
Deb,
Yep.
this is Stephanie. I had some questions and I was able to jot down some notes, but I think you would probably have the answers to this. Can you confirm or deny? But I can't remember. But Prince Albert was not well received when he first married Victoria,
Yeah.
and then after a while, and I don't know, I think it was around the potato famine in Ireland and whatnot, that he actually was able to do a lot of these things that you were showing. Is that true or not? Or do I got it mixed up?
I think he wasn't. That's not my era, but I think if I recall, he wasn't universally received, let's put it that way, when
Yeah.
first married him. Now, there were already Germans in the family, let's face it, I mean, we were talking about the Georgians last time. They were all Germans. So, but yeah, I think there was still kind of this attitude that even though Victoria in reality was a Hanoverian. I mean, it was her brother was, I mean, her father, sorry, was, one of the Georgians. But I think there was still that attitude by then that, the young, beautiful Princess Victoria should have married not a German man.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Albert had a little problem settling in, and I think that's probably the case with any queen who marries,
Mm-hmm.
king who marries. I think that's kind of common, that the prince consorts always have a slightly harder time of it. Certainly when Prince Philip married Elizabeth II, there were people who turned their noses up at this Greek, when it was really
Yeah.
Danish, it was really Danish, but I mean, they're like, but yes, and Albert was much more highly regarded as time went on, because
Yeah.
he really threw himself, again, in some ways like Prince Philip later. Not so much that Prince Philip did things with art so much, but he espoused other causes.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and then I think Albert got his reputation greatly was enhanced by those things. And then, he died tragically young. So,
Yeah, I didn't realize he died at 42. That
yeah,
that is very young. And can you remind me, how many children did they
nine
have?
children.
Jeez whiz.
Yeah, I know. They talk about the prudish Victorian era and how Victoria
Yeah.
was a prude. And she couldn't have been too much of a prude. She was having a kid. Supposedly she wasn't a prude at all. Supposedly she actually really enjoyed being married. Let's put it that way. And I would say that's evidenced by the number of children they had. Yes, and so again, they called her the grandmother of Europe because many of her children married into other European royal families, so that legacy spreads far and wide, and you still kind of see some of those connections today. Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth were distant cousins
Mhm.
through Victoria, so yeah.
Mhm.
Peter,
I believe one of the things that I read was that you know, he really had a difficult time adjusting and whatnot because of the political influences of Victoria at that time, you know, and she wanted to establish that I'm I'm married to my country. This is my husband, but I'm the monarch.
right, and I think that was the challenge for, most prince consorts. They weren't made kings. They weren't called kings. You couldn't be a king because there was nothing higher than a king. So a man marrying a queen regnant, the monarch, could never be called king. A queen, like Camilla, can be called queen because she's still below Charles, the king. She's not, even though, and I think that's, there are just a handful, obviously, of prince consorts, if you will. And a couple that were kings, obviously, William and Mary, jointly ruled. But it's a challenge, I think, to.
So how many years were they married in total? Do you know?
Oh, gosh, I'd have to look up and see when they got married. Yeah, I don't.
I know this isn't it's
Yeah, I don't know off the
fascinating
top of my
for
head.
me.
She obviously vastly she outlived him by many, 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 many decades. And she got some bad publicity because she went into a deep level of mourning and would not come out of mourning. And people started complaining, we need to see her again. We need to see her again. She's got to come out of mourning. And she finally did. But yeah, she went into quite a bit of mourning for a long
Yeah,
time.
and even though she came out of mourning, she continued to wear black a lot, right?
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, well, a lot of people when they love deeply and are so prolific in their, offspring and that kind of stuff, even in that era, you know, grief is really ongoing, long-standing, and she continued with that grief for a long time. But I also really would like to know, and I know this isn't your era, but when was the shift, and and if there is a time period when that shift happened, did anything provoke to where he was able to do things that he was particularly interested in and left it?
I can look that up. I can look into that because I'm not exactly sure when that did shift, because again, yeah, that's not really my area, but I can easily get that information for you.
And the last comment I want to make is, I think of the time when I went, and unfortunately, when I arrived there, because things were so crazy and chaotic, and I couldn't even find a native at that time, I just hopped up on a train and went all the way up to Aberdeen, where I was going to be staying with some people and using that as a base. But when I came back, I was also ill. But I did do a lot of touring of some of the places you mentioned, but I just think, man, if she goes there again, I'd like to be in her suitcase so she could take me to all these places I didn't see, and so
There's
thank you.
always more to see. You're welcome. There's always more to see. Yeah.
This was awesome.
Oh, thank you, Stephanie. Peter, you had your hand up?
Yeah, well, first of all, a comment on Victoria wearing black. Admittedly, that's the clothing of mourning, but look at that picture of August Bank month holiday, where everybody is wearing black.
Back on the beach. I love that. Yeah, they're all
I mean, the fashion was, it was like Henry Ford You can have any fashion you like, provided it's a long black dress.
That's right. Yeah, and that looks really
I don't think
comfortable,
there's any
lady.
color in that, even though it's a black and white photo. But
No.
a little on social history. In the last month or so, I've been taking a deeper dive into ancestry. And on my London side, which is half my family, and it is quite clear that the family, my grandmother's family, moved in from the countryside where they were farmers in the early to mid 1900s, and they moved into South London. And one of the relatives was a fellmonger, which is a dealer in sheep's hides. It was difficult to get anything out of my father because when my brother inquired, my father said, "Oh, well, you better not go there, son. There might be some sheep stealers." So we found that link, and a lot of them were leather workers,
Huh.
and there was a tannery, a leather center just south of the Thames, opposite the city, and they lived right next to the leather the leather center, and indeed they were leather workers where they had to report their profession on the census. And on the other side, a lot of them moved next to the London docks, and during this time the London docks were built um, just to the east of Tower Bridge. And that was becoming a major trading center. And right on the London docks was another industry called the tobacco center. And I found that about 4 of my relatives were tobacconists or tobacco and snuff makers. So presumably the tobacco was coming in from the United States and being processed right next to the dock. And the other thing is becomes fairly obvious. These people lived within 2 or 3 blocks of where they worked. They couldn't travel large distances, and both these places were slums that similar to your picture, because the density of houses was absolutely amazing. And the other thing was looking at where they were baptized or married. The number of churches in the city was huge. They built, I think, 59 new churches in London in the 1800s. They had a plan for a lot more, but only built that number. And each parish was only about 4 blocks by 4 blocks. And I like the fact you told me that everyone in a parish, if they were in that parish, they could reach the church by throwing a stone or
Yeah,
something.
just about.
It was, 100 parishes just within the little city of London. Just
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
one of the churches on one of your lists was the church that is on 2 or 3 of my forebears' birth certificates. They were born in the area of St. George in the east, which is the height of the slums. So I guess I'm pretty fortunate to be out of those slums. They were all destroyed after the war, and they moved the
Yeah.
people out. Now it's a very twee area to live
Yeah.
in.
Now all of those dock areas, those old warehouses and the docks and stuff are now super expensive.
Yeah. They're knocking them down. And then a cousin, I found out that my great, I don't know how many great grandmothers was born in Deptford, south of the London docks on the south side, which was, as I've told you, Deb, but for the others, it was a royal shipyard for 500 years. And she sent me an aerial photo, and now it's all been knocked down, waiting for gentrification.
Yeah, and Peter the Great visited there, and there's a statue to Peter the Great in Deptford.
Oh,
So it's kind of interesting. You walk around Deptford, and it's like, why is Peter the Great? Why is there a statue of Peter the Great here? Because Peter the Great was, yeah,
It was called, I think, the Royal King Henry's, the King's Dock,
King's Dock.
or the King's Wharf, was King's Wharf, I think it is.
Yeah. Yeah, all of that area has now been turned into, as you say, very twee. It's interesting again how obviously there's still, you know, a lot of social issues and poverty in London, but how all these old areas like Southwark and Spitalfields and these places that were pretty slummy are now very gentrified, and you know, it's where people want to be. It's kind of the fashionable place to be.
Yeah, the change started after the Second World War when they built subsidy housing in vast numbers in the outer suburbs.
And they started building new towns then too, literally.
Well, new towns, they're further out, because one thing about the modern London is there's a restriction on its expansion. It cannot expand beyond a certain place, and then there's 10 miles of green zone, like
Right.
a donut around it, and
Right.
there are new towns beyond that 10 miles. But where I lived as a teenager, we were surrounded by subsidy housing that was put up as they knocked down the Dockland area and resettled these people about, well, I was about 10 miles from the center of London.
Was
Yeah.
that when you were in Enfield?
In Enfield, yeah.
Yeah, north. Yeah.
After which Enfield, a little hamlet is named, and when my father visited, he made sure he had his picture taken out
Taken at the Enfield
the
here.
volunteer fire station. Enfield was had about 125,000 people in it when I was a teenager, so somewhat bigger than Enfield, New York.
Oh, yes, quite a bit, quite a bit.
I like the idea. This is Stephanie. I like the idea of having a green zone.
Yeah, they've got that in Ontario too. They have a green belt, but now it's under threat. Doug Ford, the premier of Ontario, who's a very right-wing man, is threatening to, you know, take that over and build on it, and there's a big fight over that. But yeah, that green belt area is very, yeah, it's a
The
nice
green belt was put in after the Second World War as London was continuing to expand, and the whole idea was that anybody in London should be able in a reasonable time to reach the countryside and have a picnic in the countryside. And in this green belt, there are lots and lots of paths that cross farmland, and it is a legal right to roam. So farmers expect you to stick to the path, but you can walk for miles and miles in this area. And so it does enable Londoners to get out without having to travel 100 miles, which might be the case if there was unlimited expansion. I think it's one of the great things. And this is fairly strongly regulated. You cannot build anything in that green zone unless you knock down an equivalent building. So if you bought a house that's pretty poor, you can knock it down and build a new house, but you can't on a similar footprint, but you cannot build anything new. And they will send in bulldozers to knock it down if you do. Because there was one man, it wasn't around London, but he hid what he was building by bales and bales and bales of straw, and then removed them to show this house. And I think they still came in and knocked it down.
That'll show them. That right of way is interesting too, because that's the case across Britain, those right of ways, and they will cut through, those public footpaths will cut through farmland straight across Britain, and you've got the right to walk through them. You have to be careful. I forgot where I was. Someplace way out in I don't know if it was in Suffolk or I don't know where it was, Cambridgeshire. And we were walking on one of these public footpaths, the right-of-ways out in the country. And suddenly we ended up, and this is not supposed to be legal if a right-of-way goes through your land, but this farmer obviously ignored that. We ended up going over this, you know, stile and into this pasture, and then ended up with a bull facing us. Oh boy, that was and I was like looking at the bull, and the bull was looking at us, and I'm like, okay, how far do we have to go if this thing starts charging?
Yeah, well, there's no guarantee why of what might be there. Now, I don't, my brother, if he's still listening, his name is still up, has a public footpath going across his land. I don't know if he wants to comment on this.
I don't
If
see him.
he
I think
doesn't, he
he's
must
gone.
have fallen asleep, I
Yeah, I
guess.
think we lost him. But yeah, I know, and I remember the person I was with said they're not supposed to have dangerous animal. You know, it's like a bull, a dangerous animal. So we're looking at it going,
Hey,
don't.
Deb,
Yeah.
have you ever gone up to the English Lake District?
You know, that is one area, regrettably, I have still not visited.
Well, in 1981, 1982, you know, I traveled to different parts of, you know, all over Great Britain and whatnot, but I spent a considerable amount of time in the English Lake District. And yeah, those right-of-ways were right through farmlands, and you know, you open up the gate and you know, all this other kind of stuff, and you encountered things like that. But they had wonderful how can I say it, pathways and whatnot, and maps of how you could walk around in the entire lakes that were there and whatnot. And it was magnificent. So if you get
Yeah, it's stunningly beautiful. I mean, I've seen photos and I've heard people talk about it, and it's a very popular hiking area.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's still on my list. I don't know why. I've just never gotten out there. I've been to most of Britain. Yeah, yeah, but I've never gotten to the Lake District. But yeah, no. In fact, I knew someone who lived there. I knew her after she lived there, but she was, yeah, talking about how beautiful it was. But she also talked about one time her family went to on a holiday there when she was still a kid, and they actually ended up canceling the holiday after 2 days because it was just raining and raining and raining and raining. There was nothing else
Yeah,
to do in the Lake District except walk. So they came back.
yeah, it is well, it was then. So I imagine it still is. It really did. I mean, the whole of Britain, as far as I'm concerned, when I went there and, you know, spent 8 months there, you know, cross country backpacking and all that kind of stuff. You know, it was just constant rain. You could go, like in Ireland, you could go through rain, snow, sun, and clouds all in one day.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, so but you know, yeah.
The climate change, that has changed to a degree. It's definitely gotten warmer. The summers have gotten hotter and drier in some ways. But yeah, that was that. And Ireland, yeah, well, that's why it's so green.
Yeah.
Um,
Thank you.
oh,
This
you're
has
welcome.
been great. I thought I had missed it. I thought yesterday was today, and I was so glad when I, you know, got the email, you know, of whoops, we forgot to add the Zoom thing, and so I set my timer to make sure that I was going to make it.
Oh, good. I'm glad. I'm glad you could make it. Other questions or comments? Okay, so I will see everybody next week for the final week, when we move into the 20th and now 21st centuries. I have to constantly update that lecture because every time I teach it, it changes some more. But I'll see everyone next week. Enjoy the sunshine that's out there right now, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Uh,
Bye.
Take care.
terrific again. Deb,
Thanks, Peter, and
anything?
thanks for all your observations and your stories. I love hearing the stories. So thank you for sharing those. See you later.